I'm going to speak and conduct this discussion in English, even though I know we have a German speaker, but we shall speak English, okay? Good. You can. We'll all practice our English here. Fine. Good. But before I do so, first of all, I say welcome to Professor Elham. Many heard his comments yesterday, and we are delighted that you are joining us for this discussion. And I also see that some of my latest guests are here, which is always good when I see that Jan Werner Müller has made it from Vienna. Wonderful. And as always, first of all, I say thank you to the speakers, and just remind us, so that you also know, we are, of course, with short time, so we shall pick on a few points. Now, this is a principle and method of the Karlsruhe dialogues. We are not in any way aiming at being able to speak about all the extremely important points which have been made this morning. That is the concept of what we are doing. And it is really, our thought is that then we take lots of food for thought with us. We pick up, hopefully, on some things we agree about, some things we don't agree about. And we hope that as being self-responsible citizens, we will then, after the dialogues, be able to look and see where can we find more information and how do we listen and hear things differently than we may have listened to if we only look at the tabloids or the television or internet and our usual favorite places for gathering information. So that was my first statement. I'm not going to ask questions here. I might just ask a starting question. And then I'd really ask you just to yourselves have a conversation before we go to the public. Okay? So maybe we can really start not just chronologically, but in a way, yes. Because we talked about the importance of histories, the forgetfulness of histories, I think most particularly with respect to migration, diversity, the changes in what we mean by diversity. I think that's extremely important. We have also seen that in the whole discussion in different states about multiculturalism. The whole idea of the concept has changed. What we understand by the concept has changed. So what do we do about raising awareness for diversity? Also, Emma Skye made very clear about diversity, not just in Europe or with us, but indeed diversity is a central commodity of societies in plural. And maybe just to draw in on this first round, which I will try, Poland, what about there? We have the perception very much of a more homogeneous country, but maybe that is the sort of self kind of a picture which the Visegrad states, which Poland and which many other countries are developing and politicizing in a very political kind of way. Who would like to start? Kenan, would you like to start?
Sure. Can you hear me?
It's on.
It's on, okay. I think part of the problem of historical amnesia, what I call historical amnesia, is that all sides in the debate accept the idea that Europe used to be homogenous and has become diverse, both those in favour of immigration and those against, both those in favour of diversity and those against. So I think, you know, if you say where to start, we'd start with those who actually favour diversity and immigration, but we need to understand ourselves that this is nothing new, that the questions of diversity and of immigration have always been with us. And the kinds of arguments against immigration that you see now were the kinds of arguments that were used against Jewish migrants at the turn of the last century. against Catholics emigrating to America, almost exactly the same arguments that we now have about Muslims we used about Catholics. It seems extraordinary to think about it, but that's only, what, 60, 70 years ago. So I think that's the first point, is for ourselves to recognise the issue. I think also that the question of diversity, we need to be careful how we look upon diversity. I think you raised the issue about the distinction between diversity as lived experience and multiculturalism as a political process. And those two get conflated and confused all the time. What I mean is this, that diversity as lived experiences are good. The idea of societies being more open, cosmopolitan, having different attitudes, views, lifestyles are good. The problem comes with when multiculturalism as a political process is used to essentially deny what's good about diversity. Because when those who are in favour of diversity actually never ask themselves what is good about diversity. It's not good in and of itself. Diversity is just an explanation of the world as it is. That's all it is. It's not a good in itself. What's good about diversity is that it allows us to break out of our boxes, to think, to listen to people who have views and attitudes very different from ours, and to be able to have a debate with them about our views and their views, and to have often some kind of challenge, confrontation. That's all for the good. We've become too fearful, I think, about the idea of confrontation or challenge or dispute or those are all good. But what is important is that we have a framework in which those kinds of confrontations and dialogues become useful. And that's what's failing. And the way we look at multiculturalism, by putting people into boxes, saying, you are black, you are Muslim,
Can I just go in, but aren't people also putting themselves into boxes? And maybe I ask, how is the process, which you made, very much about social groups, the pressure of social groups, which I think is very, very central. Also to, if we go from diversity to the life in our cities, before we go to the international, is very much organized, that people put themselves into immaterial cultural boxes themselves. They organize themselves in neighborhoods where they do everything to avoid diversity. There is no dialogue, and at the same time, we talk about how are we going to get rid of the boxes, how do we organize meeting places, because otherwise people don't meet.
Yeah. Now, if you allow me, I will basically give you an example, a personal one. When I came to Switzerland, 1995, people used to ask me, where do you come from? Okay, and I used to answer, I come from Yemen. Okay, and the answer from their side, oh, either they knew about it, Märchen land, seems to be like having this kind of like fairy tale image, specifically the Yemeni architect, or they would ask me about the country. 2001, 9/11, the terrorist attacks. I've been afterwards called a Muslim. I got invitations as a Muslim. What do you think about this and this? No more. That national boundary doesn't exist anymore. Muslim, okay, but I've been traveling a lot in Morocco. A Moroccan is not Yemeni, a Yemeni is not Tunisian, a Tunisian is not Saudi Arabian. And yet, we are put into boxes. So it comes, you have one direction coming from the wider society. But you have also other forces, you know. And forces which I call basically political movements with a political ideology using religion. And these very often use an identity kind of language to put us also into boxes, and with it certain policies. But you also have another dimension, and that I saw also in the United Kingdom, where you have politicians who are playing on the same game and exacerbating the problem. And with this identity politics, we will not be a plural society living together on equal respect and acceptance. No, we will be tribalized.
Yes, I think this is a big argument within sociology also.
Sure, but what I want to pick up on what you said, because I talked about historical amnesia before. We also have historical amnesia about the presence of Muslims in the West. In that we look at Muslims, Muslim communities, Muslim attitudes now, and imagine that that has always been the case. In fact, there's been a historical shift, a huge historical shift in both communities and attitudes over the past 60 years. So the first generation of Muslims who come to Europe, some of them are very pious. Most of those who came to Britain were piously Muslim. Those who came to France from Muslim majority countries largely weren't. So that distinction's always erased. But piety meant something very different to my parents' generation than it does now. Now, my parents' generation rarely attended mosque. You know, they attended mosque when the Friday feeling took them. The men drank. They weren't ostracized for it. You wouldn't have seen a hijab, let alone a burqa or a niqab in those communities. My generation, second generation, is a generation of who were largely secular. We didn't think of ourselves as Muslim or Hindu or Sikh there was no such thing as a Muslim community. We talk about a Muslim community. It did not exist until the 1990s. And we forget that. The Muslim community was a creation of a lot of different forces, but it was a creation in the 1990s. So we also recognize the historical shifts and not have historical amnesia about this is what a Muslim is, this is what a Muslim community is, these are what Muslims believe in. Because it's changed, even in the course of 50 years, it's changed quite dramatically.
Emma, you made the point about the mistakes made by setting up in Iraq a system probably kind of built on our perception of what representation could be, but of course which absolutely brought the boxies back in again. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about not just what happened, but the way of thinking? Because I think very much states have their way of thinking. And of course, if we talk about what we mean by multiculturalism, the French and the British model couldn't be further apart in what they mean by that. I think probably the practice is different, but the model and the way of thinking of the way it was set up. Would you like to perhaps say what was the way of thinking of bringing a democratic system based on representation according to religion and so on?
Well, we have to blame the Balkans a lot for this, because a lot of people who went to work in Iraq had worked in the Balkans, and I think the whole idea of ancient hatreds, that terminology, if you like, was popularized by a book called Balkan Ghosts by Robert Kaplan, is that right? Which, you know, the dynamics that take place in these countries are very complex. And people look for simple explanations. And they look at the Balkans, they think people in the Balkans broke down into civil war because it's Serb, Croat, Bosniaks, and if you remove a dictator, the only thing that kept them together was Tito. You had the same formulation of thinking in the Middle East, that people said, Sunni, Shia, Kurd, these people have been fighting each other for centuries. Well, again, it goes back to historical amnesia, because they haven't been fighting each other for centuries. They won't be 30% intermarried. You know, Sunni and Shia speak the same language. They intermarry. People even switched from one to the other. But when the coalition came in, its conceptualization was in terms of homogeneous, antagonistic communities. And it was advised by exiles mainly, and exiled Islamists who also shared that essentialist view of what an Iraqi was. So you had the Kurdish ethno-nationalists, and you had the Islamists, the Shia Islamists, who shared that same portrayal. Now, it suited them because that's how they could come to power. The struggle in Iraq, the causes of the civil war, it's a competition for power and resources. And how these new elites maneuvered was to mobilize people using religion. And the way the electoral system was set up for the first election made that the way to do it. So they would say, vote for me because I'll protect you from them. So they campaigned as Shia, they campaigned as Sunni, they campaigned as Kurd. And that just exacerbated the difference in society. They weren't saying, I will deliver jobs, I will build infrastructure. It all became fear of the other in order to mobilize. So you see these political entrepreneurs, the same dynamics that's happened in the Balkans has happened in Syria and Iraq. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because once the genie's out of the box, and once people have been killed, people are fearful, state weak, they retreat into tribe.
I think tribe is a point which we can even look at with, according to, of course, the resurgence of homogeneous national identity, which we are seeing in Poland. We will be talking about this also this afternoon. But before we get to the media, the politicization of national identity. Polish is Polish, is obviously on the similar lines, but with a national state boundary, whereas in the communities which are diverse, we have the same thing happening within we will be looking at this also this afternoon, nativism and nationalism, which are of course very similar concepts of organizing groups according to their self-ascribed or from outside ascribed identities. Poland, what is being described as Polish at the moment?
Well, it's a kind of a difficult question. I could, have another speech about it. But the problem is for the last 3 centuries, we had such a conflict inside the Polish society. Poland was divided in the 18th century between Russia, Austria, and Prussia, and was recreated after World War I. And in spite of this division, the country and the society, remained. And the problem was, what does it mean to be? What does it mean to be a Pole? To be to go across the borders, be cosmopolitan, in touch with Paris, London, Berlin, or just remain at your community and at your small field. You are just working all the day, or have your peasants working there when you were a noble. So there's a problem of horizon. Where does being Polish ends? The problem today is that I believe that this national sentiment is a kind of shelter. We live in a society of dramatic change, which has no end, which was started, right after fall of the communism, where the revolution, digital revolution, social revolution, European Union, refugees, global crisis, globalization. So, the people are not sure of anything. When I was graduating from my university, the students of the economy had advantage because they were needed by rapidly growing business. Business is now saturated. They don't know specialists for economy. They need specialists from human sciences now. So people who invested in human sciences right after graduation couldn't find a good job, now have better prospects, for example. So we couldn't be sure of anything. No profession would guarantee you profits for the end of your life. Nothing is secured, and the people are simply afraid because the world is changing too rapidly. And now we have the nationalists, the populists, like Kaczynski, who I was talking about, like Mr. Trump, like Frauke Petri, like Erdogan, who are just promising people just to turn back the clock, just get us back to the old good 60s, where everything had its order. The Muslims were in Muslim countries, they didn't invade Europe. I don't believe in this phrase, I'm just quoting some people. When women just stayed at home, didn't interfere in political matters which were dealt by men, where children were raised to be proper citizens, where students were studying, not making politics at universities, when everybody went to church on Sunday and listened to the pastor, to the priest. So the 60s were the golden age of conservatives. Everything had an order, and people are looking for this order now. I believe that there's a core factor of success of people like Trump, like Kaczynski, like Orban, like Erdogan. They want to re-establish old order, which could not be established again because we have this digital revolution, we have globalization, we have European Union interconnections before states. It's not going to happen again. So this is a kind of a big lie, promising people we could have old good 60s again. That's not going to happen, but people are so despair to look for some kind of pattern in all those happening around them. In 90s, we have MySpace. At the beginning of year 2000, everybody who had access to internet had an account on MySpace. Now is a Facebook. We don't know what's going to happen in next decade. So even in the small piece of digital business, we see such dramatic changes, such dramatic transformations. People simply want to have peace, to have global framework, to have a local framework, to have a space which is limited by some boundaries where they could move. The most exciting thing is that we have abolished communism because we wanted the freedom. We have received freedom, and we can behave properly because we have too much freedom. And maybe there's a chance, maybe there's a kind of danger. Too much freedom could kill you.
Okay, thank you. You wanted to comment?
No, actually, I wanted to comment on Emma.
Yes.
I actually agree with you 100% when it comes to the mistakes that was done after the invasion of Iraq. The problem is when it comes to what was there before, because I have the impression in order for us to analyze the problem, we also have to look at the historical situation there, because it's like, from my perspective in Iraq, the regime did have a certain ethnic character. That he came from Tikrit, he came from Sunni background, and we saw a certain kind of backlash against the Shia and the Kurds in certain historical periods. The current history. If I look in Syria, I see an ethnicized kind of political elite. If I look at Yemen, I see also specifically with north of Yemen, you had an ethnicized political elite coming from a certain group. And that, from my perspective, has led to all the kind of like frustration that we have, where we don't have this state that treat us as equal before the law. And the United States, when they came, and the policies that were basically adopted, actually reinforced the worst aspect that should have been actually dealt with. I just wanted, basically, that's, because I think if we are to move forward, specifically with what is happening right now in Syria and Yemen, one day we will have peace, like it or not. People will be tired of killing each other. Now, how are we going to find solutions? And without acknowledging past grievances, we will not move forward.
Emma.
It's very hard to really understand what was the nature of Iraq before the invasion, because there was very little research done on it, and it was very closed off. But I think when Saddam Hussein first came to power, he was not sectarian. He was an absolute, brutal, equal opportunities mass murderer. He would murder anybody who opposed him. And right at the beginning, when he came to power, his first act was to kill his best friend. He loved this guy, but he wanted to show people that he was even prepared to kill his best friend. now he had his inner circle was people from his town. It wasn't from his clan, if you like. It wasn't because they were Sunni, it's because they were from his clan. He didn't trust the guys out in Ramadi. He had huge problems with the guys in Ramadi, Sunni. They were always rebelling against him. And when you look at the Iran-Iraq war during the 80s, people refer to that almost as the height of Iraqi nationalism. Now, 80% of Iraq's conscripts would have been Shia, but they fought as Iraqis against Iran. So it was very much portrayed as, you know, Arab against the Safavid Persians. I think things changed in Iraq during the 90s under sanctions. Sanctions had a devastating impact on the society, really impoverishing it, destroyed the middle classes, destroyed schools, destroyed all of this. And Saddam, during that stage, to try and deflect attention away from himself, introduced a faith campaign. And this faith campaign had people going to the mosque, becoming much more aware of their religion and their sect. So that's when people look at, when did this idea of being a Sunni Shia come in? You hear Iraqis say, oh, we never had Sunni Shia before. Well, that's nonsense. Never to this height that we have today. But really the Islamic Revolution in Iran, 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran, that was what heightened sectarianism. So you have that. Then you have the 90s under sanctions. But the 2003 war has taken sectarianism to a whole level that has never been seen in the region before. But there was obviously something there. They didn't decide to mobilize people on class. The political entrepreneurs decided to mobilize people based on sect and ethnicity. So there was something there.
Thank you very much. I would like maybe to pick up, because I know how time is flying, to pick up Manea and the question of Sharia as one reinforcing way of creating boxes, but of course also the question of the social control, not just because of religion. Certainly I think it's a general question of tribalism, of the politicization of the diaspora, which is one of the questions we are looking at also here in Germany. With the Turkish situation of the sectarian Turkish and the conservative Turkish, of being politicized here. So what do we see about the reinforcing through such instruments, I would say, in some ways meant as being more liberal, pluralistic, allowing different kinds of law and judiciary, and the actual practice, which I think we have seen from you, and which I would also agree with what I have read. I've left the UK a long time ago, but I'd like to see what you think about this.
About Sharia specifically, or
yes, I mean perhaps I just can provocate. I can remember, and I mentioned it here many years ago, that we had the situation where arranged marriages, but not just arranged marriages, question of suicide or honor, so-called honor killings within the UK system were not recognized. They were not recognized as such and had to be called back. More than 100 cases, if I remember rightly, in 2004, because coroners and doctors hadn't looked carefully enough and hadn't recognized that in fact it was not a natural death. I mean, that's a very extreme, but it is a case of the way we look at things, the way we want to accommodate diversity and pluralism in a very negative way. I'm provocating, but I think it's a reality.
I think we need to distinguish between, or not conflate, say, arranged marriage, forced marriage, and honour killings. They're very different issues.
I was only using it as an example. I really want to go on to more about how these things are reinforcing tight communities, close communities, and the problem of what you called suffocating social control.
I think part of the problem is that the authorities and liberals more generally have a notion of what an authentic Muslim is. I remember having a conversation with Nasser Hadda, who's a Danish MP, Muslim background, thinks of himself as secular, not as particularly religious. And he told me about a conversation he had with a leading journalist in Denmark shortly after the Danish caricatures debate. And this leading journalist said to him, all Muslims are hostile to the cartoons. And Nasser Hannah said, I'm not. To which the journalist replied, but you're not a proper Muslim. In other words, to be a proper Muslim is to find those cartoons offensive, to be reactionary, to be right-wing. And this comes from a liberal viewpoint. So that what the liberals do is to have the same view of Muslims as the anti-Muslim bigots do. The anti-Muslim bigots see all Muslims as reactionary. They don't belong to our country, they don't belong to Europe. They find any criticism, any ridicule abusive, they can't stand it. Of course, liberals then say actually exactly the same thing from a different perspective, but they say exactly the same thing and they end up in the same place. And that's the problem. The problem is this notion of authenticity, of what is really a Muslim, or really, what is it to be really of this religion, of that community. And in the end, what happens is that the most conservative reactionary figures are seen as the representative voices because they are seen as the authentic voice of that community. And liberal, progressive voices are ignored because they're seen as they're too Western, they're not part of that community. And I think that's a real problem that we face.
Would anyone like to comment on that? Emma?
No, I was just laughing when you were talking because, Abu Hamza, the guy with, one hand with a hook, and he was always being, interviewed, or Chowdhury. The most extreme people were given media time when they weren't representative of the community. I mean, Abu Hamza looked like a villain. He'd lost his hand making explosives. And he was always given media time. So I think it's, you can understand from a journalist's perspective, it makes good entertainment. But it's not fair on a whole community that totally rejects, you can think of all the diversity, all those different opinions. Why are the journalists looking for the most extreme view?
May I just basically, if we're talking about right now, going back to your question, we're talking about plural society. How do we live in plurality? Okay, think of it as a football field, football game. That game has rules, We know what are the rules there. Outside, you could do whatever you want, But these rules are binding here. So you cannot come and tell me I'd like to play with my head or my hand. The football game tells you we're playing with the foot, with the feet. You play with one ball, And from that perspective, what I mean is shared values. And it's not a kind of imposition of Western values. I'm talking about universal values. And when I talk about universal values, I talk about issues. It's like fundamental rights, equality, freedom of expression is also not negotiable because it's the check of balance. It's like we actually check tyranny by making sure that we can express ourselves. And we have men and women paying with their lives and with their liberty in the Middle East because they want this liberty.
So in fact, now this is again, I think, a very central point. You said with the whole discussion on post-colonialism, the burden of the white man. Because we want to accommodate and don't realize that by some of the arrangements which we are accommodating, we are in fact ourselves strengthening the possibility of discrimination. Because we don't take the situation of persons who, from our meaning, seem to be in a different ethnicity, a different culture, so we don't want to get involved. It's their decision, etc. I would like, just before, because I know two questions, and then we shall see if we have 2 or 3 very quick comments. first of all, how do we manage to start talking about universal values and universal rights? How do we break down the thought of, or the political, I'm thinking again German, the political attempt to make universal values and rights seen as being Western, and therefore not universal. I think this is what we heard last night with Slatko Sakumtica, and I think it's the most central point. How do we get the generations, first, second, third, that we find the first generation? I think we see this also with the refugees. The first generation is very much more interested in finding out how can we be part of a new home, of a new society. But of course, the third generation is home, and they say, we have our rights, which are very diverse. How do we go about this?
I think the first point is that we ought to be careful in how we use the concept of shared values. Yeah. Because I'm someone who believes in universal values. In other words, I believe that there are certain values, certain forms of governance, certain institutions under which all humans best flourish. But to me, the idea of shared values can also be really dangerous. It leads to a situation as in Poland, where it is seen as there are certain shared values, which are the values that make you Polish, or the values that make you French, and that certain groups don't belong because they're outside of those values. So I think it's important to see that values are always contested. And it's important to accept their contestation, because it is out of that contestation, out of the debate that we have, that we actually come to what we have in common. So we shouldn't simply accept these are shared values. We'll say we will contest what the values are that we wish to share. And including those values we might find abhorrent, that people have the right to express those values, not the right to necessarily to practice them, but to express those values, and to say that we will not listen to them, or we will not debate them, is wrong. So I think it's a kind of it's a difficult point to make, because shared values are always seen as given set of values that we must share in order to live in a common society. They're not. Values are always contested. There are certain, people talk about British values or German values. There are certain British values or values arisen out of the British tradition that I like, and there are certain ones which I abhor. So I don't accept that I support British values in any sense. I support certain values which I believe in, and I will argue for them. So the notion of universal values is not the same thing as insisting that all people should have those values, or can only talk if they have those values. But it is that there are certain values that we hold, that we will contest, and hopefully we will persuade others to that point of view.
Directly to there and then you, okay?
Okay. No, I just wanted basically to say here that, yes, this is like the idea of a plural democratic system based on human rights is the ability to contest, and we could contest the values, But while we're doing that, I think there are certain kind of like red lines that I will not cross. Can you tell me right now that we could contest the fact that children can marry? We are debating this here now. And from that context, it's that while we're talking, let's give concrete examples, context, and consequences. What does this mean for a child? My mother was married when she was 13 years. She told me her history, what happened to her. It wasn't funny. So from that perspective, what are the consequences when we are talking about such issues? There are things, I think Karl Popper here can be used when he talks about intolerance. There are certain, we can check intolerance with public discourses, with our dialogue, but there are certain type of intolerance that has consequences that, with all due respect, I will not accept.
I think we need to make a distinction between values and practices. That there are, that we all live in the way that you talked about within a single set of laws, and that practices that cut against those laws should not be allowed. So there are three things I'd say, three differences. First, values in terms of what we believe. We should be as open as possible in allowing people to express their values and their desires and their arguments and have as wide an expression of speech as possible. We should allow practices that arise out of those values, so long as those practices do not undermine the rights of others or undermine the rule of law. And thirdly, we should insist that there is only one set of laws that apply to all people in a nation. So I think there are kind of three distinctions I would make in terms of values, practices, and law, and we should look at each of those differently.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay. So I'm not clearly convinced that the set of Polish values differs a lot of set of British values or German values. Of course, we have different history. You have a queen, we have a president, but we have a lot of common ground. And the problem is that part of my society, as well as part of your society, is unable to raise itself from these national roots and find that what was common to us. So on the European level. I do believe in European Union, I do believe in the notion of common Europe. And when we speak about diversity, Europe is the best example. The colorful you are, the richer you are. This kind of mechanism now in biology, well, you can't breed, good horses in one family. You have to get extra genetical input to breed better horses, to make the new generation of horses, other animals, stronger. That's why we need also, input in Europe. We can just remain close on our borders. We need, well, I don't know, the notion of fresh blood is good, especially here, but we need more ideas. We need more, intelligent, capable people. We need to be open for them, for new thinking and for new people. And the problem is some countries of Europe which were suffering from communism, from closeness, in East Germany, in Poland, Czechoslovakia, you couldn't cross the border as you wish now. You would be shot. And this period of closeness has its long-lasting effects on the societies, and some people are simply unable to understand it, that European level is better than national level, that you need to be open, that not all of people coming from Middle East as refugees are of course not terrorists, which is presented in media. But the most important thing is to talk why do we need European Union, why do we need to be open, why do we need diversity, why do we need such universal values? Because we have received it in our set as a granted, as something sacred. And we need a discussion, why is it so? Why the rule of law is so important in my country? Just we have to clarify the people that without free judges, without free courts, you would have a free and just verdict during a juridical procedure. It's simple like that. But someone has to explain it to people and also to the politicians that you can't run a mother country without rule of law, for example. You can run a mother country without openness, without a culture of diversity. You can't run a country being, which is in European Union, violating the core rules of European Union. So we need a long-lasting discussion, which should be started as early as possible. I think that you have to speak about that with school children and to make them aware and also immune towards some, populistic arguments.